is protecting children in Ukraine, response by the international community. We have a distinguished panel with a distinguished moderator, Ambassador Yuliya Kovaliv, Ambassador of Ukraine to Canada, who I've had the great privilege of collaborating with previously on the PS 752 file and now in organizing this event. Welcome, Ambassador, and our distinguished panel.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody, and it's my big honor to be the moderator of the panel with this important conference. As we have talked a lot about the investigation of the war crimes, about the justice, about the responsibility, all this can be done successfully in partnership. We are very grateful to many of the distinguished delegates for this conference who represents the governments, Minister Shelly, Minister Verani, and many more. But also I would like to stress that our ability to investigate, to document these war crimes, and also our work even on the things like bringing back the children would be impossible without the role of our international partners and also with the role of the civil society. Only together we can work successfully, and only by joining the efforts of both the governments, both the international institutions, but also the civil society, we can become more practical in achieving our goal, both pursuing the justice and bringing back the children, and then walk with them this long way to reintegrate them in their families, to help them to cure them from all of the horror that they lived through. And I'm really happy to have a very distinguished panel today with us. I would like to introduce shortly the panelists. We have Darya Gerasimchuk, the Commissioner of the President of Ukraine on Children's Rights and Children's Rehabilitation. I'm also happy that we have today on the panel Shelly Whitman, Executive Director of Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. We have in person with us Lesia Zaburanna, Member of the Parliament of Ukraine. I'm also happy that today with us online we have also Aagje Ieven, the Secretary General of Missing Children Europe. Thank you for joining us online. It's a bit late in Europe. We still have the day in Canada. And it's my great pleasure also that we have Oleksandra Matviichuk with us, one of the most prominent leaders of the civil society in Ukraine, whose activities have been recognized with the Nobel Prize. Oleksandra is traveling. We were with her in Halifax just yesterday, and she is joining us on her way back. So she will join with from the airport. Probably we will miss her at some point of time as she is flying, but thank you, Oleksandra, for being with us. I would like to build our panel probably with some questions that I would ask all of our panelists. And I will start with Darya. Darya, can you, being the Commissioner on Children's Rights and Children's Rehabilitation, you work a lot with our international partners. You work a lot with the civil society. Can you please tell us how this cooperation works? And if you will be so kind to tell us what works and where there is still a big room of improvements and where the civil society and international organizations can step in to help you in your very important journey.
Thank you for the possibility to speak today. After the beginning of Russian invasion of Ukraine, no one can feel safe anywhere until the aggressor will be defeated. This is what every day in Ukraine proves. Everything that the Russian troops and special services are doing on our land against our people, against our children. And this is what they dream of bringing to the lands of other nation. The whole world knows this. Unfortunately, the most horrible part of these stories and the biggest evidence of Russian crimes are the destinies and lives of Ukrainian children. Children's lives and destinies have been damaged or destroyed. Each of 7.5 million Ukrainian children who lived in Ukraine before the 24th of February 2022 were affected by this horrible war. All cases of killing and maiming, forced displacement or deportation, sexual violence, or missing of Ukrainian children are recorded on the state-owned web portal Children of War, where the relevant data is updated on a daily basis. Speaking about deported or enforceably displacement children, as for today, according to the state portal Children of War, 19,546 children deported to the Russian Federation or forcibly relocated to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Nearly 4,390 of them as orphans or children without parental care. But this is the children about whom we know exactly. And we understand this amount is bigger. We think that it could be hundreds of thousands of children. Children are being kidnapped from the territories of Ukraine in the various situations. It is the 387 stories, few of which you already saw today, that the children told after their return that allow us to clearly define the scenarios of the abduction of Ukrainian children by the Russians. After all our analysis, we could say that Russians have the following 6 scenarios for the removal of children. First one is when the parents were killed and such children are forcibly relocated by the Russians. The second scenario, children were removed directly from their family. The third, parents are separated from their children during filtering. Fourth scenario, removal of institution in full stop. Fifth is creation of conditions unfit for life and the offer to hand over children for rehabilitation or recreation. This is one of the most numerous scenarios of children's kidnapping. And sixth scenario, removal of children under the pretense of treatment in medical institutions of Russia. The re-education and indoctrination of our children, which are carried out in the camps and at the occupied territories, forced Russification and a total ban on everything Ukrainian, are aimed at erasing the identity of belonging to the Ukrainian nation. From the very beginning, Ukraine speaks loudly about the fact that the actions of the Russians were well planned and aimed at destroying the future of Ukraine as a nation. Fact that the Russians did not plan and do not plan to return abducted children is evidenced by the simplified procedure for granting Russian citizenship for children, the simplified procedure to their adoption. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Putin. This confirms that there was no evacuation of Ukrainian children, but rather kidnapping by the Russian authorities. Ukraine is taking action. Ukraine is taking action. Our president instructed the government to create a plan called Bring Kids Back UA. This plan involves 7 blocks, including bringing Ukrainian children home from Russia, Belarus, or temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, caring for them in families, helping them return to a normal life, and ensuring their safety. We also keep going to establish a special international expert group to protect children's rights and hold Russia accountable for its actions. Bring Kids Back UA unites the efforts of all authorities of Ukraine, other states, international and non-governmental organizations for the return to their homeland of all Ukrainian children who were forcibly deported to Russia. Different parts of our government are responsible for different aspects of this plan. We are working with the United Nations, ICC, OSCE, ICRC, EU, different countries, and their governments and state bodies to stop and prevent harm to Ukrainian children. The Bringing Back UA action plan is aimed at implementing President Volodymyr Zelensky peace formula. Point 4. Release all prisoners and deportees. Bring Kids Back UA is the main and basic plan of action. Any country, organization, or person will be able to join the implementation of this initiative within the framework of the action plan. Many foreign partners of Ukraine have also already declared their support and readiness to help protect the rights of our children. At a meeting of advisor on national security and foreign policy in Malta, a proposal was put forward to establish an international coalition of nations dedicated to facilitating the return of Ukrainian children who have been deported or forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. The proposal, initiated by the Canadian delegation, received widespread support from numerous participating countries in Malta, signifying a collective commitment to this humanitarian course. In the same time, Canada is a co-chair of a newly created Kiev CAC group of France. We pledge to follow the laws and protect children. We will ensure that Ukrainian children are safe, and we will speak up for them when they can't speak for themselves. Let's do utmost to protect the children of Ukraine together today, as tomorrow it could be any child in any country around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Darya, for briefing and putting a note of all the efforts that Ukraine is doing. And I would like then to switch to our partners. And I would like to ask Aagje. Aagje, you're Secretary General of Missing Children Europe. And since the war started, you were also behind the quick crisis response and the hotlines set up separately and especially for the missing children Ukraine EU. How do you see the response also from the non-government organizations, both in Europe, here in North America, and what could be done more? Or is it done enough and there is a space that we can all do more?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. First of all, to the Centre for inviting me to speak, and secondly for this interesting question. Maybe to give a bit more background about what Missing Children Europe does. We're a European organisation. We're an umbrella organisation for about 33 missing children organisations in 27 European countries, and we act as a coordinator for the 116000 hotlines. Now, that's not a newly established hotline. It's existed since 15 years. It was set up by the EU in the EU member states, but Ukraine for several years has also had the 116000 hotline. So there's a few, I think about 5 non-EU countries in the EU neighborhood who also have that same number dedicated to hotlines for missing children. And it's a number that children and parents can call to report cases of missing children, but also to receive legal, social, and psychological support in navigating the system when your child has gone missing. And it's comparable to the US Center, NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, although the remit and of course the goal is slightly different. But just to give you an idea of what we do, and we're the umbrella of all the civil society organizations. Our job is to ensure that there's shared standards of quality for the hotlines, that these are integrated into national protection systems, and that there's cross-border coordination. Until recently, until the 24th of February 2022, the cross-border coordination of missing children cases was limited. But after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, evidently that became a big thing for us, and we had to switch gears, and could switch gears quite quickly. Our organization organized last week just a symposium together with OSCE, with NATO, with UNHCR and the EU to talk about what we might have learned from this crisis in Ukraine. And it's more than a crisis, of course, but what we'd learned from it. And one of the outcomes of that was that indeed, and the observation that NGOs can respond quite quickly, whereas international organizations and governments can sometimes, are a bit slower in their response, evidently because they have to follow certain rules and certain protocols, and we can base ourselves a little bit more on personal relationships of trust or organizational relationships of trust. So we have that opportunity to react a bit more quickly. And then what I'm going to say, I want to lift out a few things. First of all, a short overview of what we've done and what our member organization NGO Magnolia, that operates the hotline in Ukraine, has done. Then a little bit on the numbers of children that they've been working with, how they've been collecting evidence of war crimes, how they've been supporting parents. Also, what their role is in reuniting children with their families and what's needed to keep doing that on the long term. And then last but not least, some recommendations in terms of a call to international society on how to support that implementation of return, re-establish respect for human rights and rule of law, and how NGOs can be supported to play their role in that. So a short overview of what we did. NGO Magnolia is a big organization, or it's not a big organization, but it's well known. It was founded by TV journalists, and they have a program on missing children that shows posters and lifts out cases for missing children that's well watched in the country. And so when the full-scale invasion happened, and in the chaos, a lot of children suddenly went missing. A lot of families suddenly got separated. They were absolutely flooded still with calls and with requests on their Facebook and on their website. It was very challenging for them. Our hotline operators had to work from bomb shelters in those first days, but they kept providing 24/7 since day one that operational support, working from in very unsafe conditions, working from their phones, but they persevered and continued offering the services and maintained the hotline 24/7, overcoming all of the challenges. As an initial response to support operations of Magnolia and to address the increasing instances of children going missing, Missing Children Europe's immediate response has been to launch a specific website. And this is something we also had seen in previous, across the world in other instances, when you have a sudden huge influx of children going missing because of like a sudden event. It's good to have one established website where all of the missing children posters are. And so we established that with posters, with information on how to report a missing child, with information in Ukrainian for Ukrainian parents, with a reporting form in different languages. And we also established a central help desk. So we immediately hired a Ukrainian speaker who could provide information to all of our hotlines across the continent, and who could help Ukrainians that were fleeing the country and who'd gotten separated on the way in language they understand, and to help people navigate the different systems in the country of displacement. So NGOs can be agile, react quickly, fill gaps, and work in that gray zone based on interpersonal, interorganizational relationships. But ultimately, and that was also one of the recommendations from the Crisis Response Symposium that we had last week, responsibility shouldn't be shifted on them. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Use us, absolutely, but don't overburden us. And if we are needed to support, the capacity to do this also needs to be supported. So that's definitely a first call to international society in terms of yes, we are there. We can fill in gaps. We can respond quickly, but we also need to be supported to continue to do that on the long term, because otherwise you'll have burnout. You'll have, the capacity will just wear out. One of the things we've also been doing is awareness campaigns. Besides those posters of missing children, we have, from the moment it became clear that so many children were going missing due to suspected forcible deportations to Russia or Russian occupied territories, those 20,000 children, we have been calling on all EU and Council of Europe actors, our peers, sharing information about what we were seeing, sharing our suspicion that there was going to be evidence that would eventually amount to war crime and potentially also to genocide. We dedicated our 20th anniversary event last year to the issue and really brought in our patrons, the Belgian royal family, but also a vice president of the EU, vice president of the European Commission, and the Parliament, both of them, and really try to make a lot of noise and call the attention to it, to get people going and trying to figure out what could be done. And I think that's also definitely something where NGOs can support, really raising awareness. We've continued to, we've worked together with, I think, with a lot of actors in terms of publishing recommendations on what could be done. And today is one of those places where we try to share those based on what we've learned. We've engaged in trainings, and I think that's also something that's been important, trainings of border guards and trainings of helplines together with UNICEF, with other CEPOL and the EU Asylum Agency. We also engage with law enforcement, anti-trafficking organizations, humanitarian groups, and child rights organizations for comprehensive support in prevention and for concrete cases, and in general also through joint advocacy, exchange of best practices, and support in concrete cases of children at risk. Capacity is limited, and I already mentioned it, but capacity building and funding provisions are absolutely needed. And so that strong cooperation is important. I think in all of this, one of the things that we noticed was that there was constantly this risk of international NGOs or international crisis response organizations coming in and putting a layer over the existing work and the existing organizations in Ukraine that were already doing a lot of good work. And the government, of course, that's been quite resilient. So I think that's definitely something in terms of working with international society, and the recommendation or the call that we'd like to make is that yes, cooperation, and definitely look at what is already there and see how that can be complemented rather than putting a new layer over it and then retreating and it not being sustainable. And in the meantime, the existing organizations having weakened. So I think whatever response comes in needs to really look at what is already there and support the NGOs and the official organizations that are already on the ground doing the work, already cooperating, making sure there isn't a layer over that. And I think that's something that risk we've seen a few times, and we've had to shout hard sometimes to say, like, oh, but we're already doing this. So can you support us rather than build something new? Specifically on the children reported missing and found, we have supported around 70 cases in Europe, but these are not the ones that we're discussing today in terms of the 20,000 children who are still missing, most likely in occupied territory or in Russia itself. And it's really more than 20,000 children. Magnolia, our member in Ukraine, has been involved in, I think, about 47 cases where they have been able to contribute evidence and collect evidence on the deportation and forced displacement to Russia and Russian occupied territories, which they forwarded to Ukrainian authorities. They do this together with other organizations, of course. This takes education and manpower. It wasn't easy for them to start collecting that evidence because that was not what they were doing before. There were helplines supporting psychologists, supporting parents, helping them navigate an existing system. collecting evidence to prove war crimes is something that this NGO particularly didn't do before. Of course, they were getting the evidence, they were getting reports, so they were an ideal partner to work with, but they needed specific new capacity, a lot of capacity and training to do so. And so I think that's something where international communities can support NGOs in doing that, in providing that, that possibility to expand capacity and to get that training. That has been absolutely key for them. And what they've noticed is that there's different ways in which children going missing. For them, the information comes in because parents or caregivers call about children going missing. And so sometimes that's parents who voluntarily let their children go to a safe zone, which was then evidently in the only corridor that was open to them was in Russia or occupied territory. And then after a week or two, this was offered to them while the front was moving. And then after a week or two, the children would lose contact with their parents, or the parents would lose contact with the children or the families.
I'm very sorry, but I just want to go through all of our panelists,
Sure.
but I have definitely a question to you. Yes, and I just urge all of the rest our panelists. I will be a bad policeman on the panel, so more than 5 minutes. And excuse me, I will be interrupting you because I want to have a more live discussion. Oleksandra.
Okay.
It's a great pleasure to have you, Oleksandra. Matviichuk. Oleksandra has the human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine, and just at the end of last year, the Center of Civil Liberties received the Nobel Peace Prize. And I saw Oleksandra in action. Oleksandra is traveling a lot now around the world and advocates a lot for Ukraine. And including for the bringing back Ukrainian children. We just, as I mentioned, saw each other in Halifax in Security Forum. Oleksandra, as you're reaching to many non-government organizations around the world, what's your message to them? And what's their response to you when it comes to the support to bring the children back?
Thank you very much for providing me the floor. It's a huge honor for me to address to this distinguished audience. Today we're speaking about Ukrainian children in times of war in this very hard point of discuss, because Russia uses war crimes as the method of warfare. When large-scale invasion started, we faced with unprecedented amounts of war crimes, the victims of which were children. In our database, Tribunal for Putin Initiative, for current moment, we jointly together with other partners and regional organizations documented more than 57,000 episodes of war crimes. And unfortunately, a lot of these episodes was also connected with crimes against women and children, because Russian troops deliberately destroy residential buildings, schools, churches, hospitals. They attack evacuation corridors. They organize forcible deportations. They arrest parents in the filtration camps and give their children for adoption to Russian families. They carry out the policy of forced re-education of Ukrainian children as Russians in the occupied territories, which reveals the genocidal intent at the heart of these Russian invasions. And we, as documentators, we now saw how this war very quickly turned people into the numbers, because the scale of war crimes grows so large that it's become impossible to recognize all the stories. And that is why it's so important to tell stories. And probably I will share with this audience the story of 13-year-old Yuliya, who last year found himself and his mother and his little 3-year-old brother under Russian occupation in the village in the Kiev region. There was no electricity in the house. They had hardly any water and food. They were spending whole days in the cellar. And his mother said that she addressed many bodies for the Russians to allow her to take her children to a safe place by car. And Russians seemed to agree. Moreover, they even waved as if wishing them a happy journey. But when the family was well in the village, the Russian military opened fire on civilians' car, in which were women and children. And the car stopped, and people from there began to fall out on the field. And Yelisei was among those children who died. So what I want to tell with this story, that people are not numbers, and we have to find a way how as international community, not only to effectively investigate such crimes and document such crimes, and not only to contribute to the punishment for war crimes, but also to find a way to return Ukrainian children home, to stop Russian from committing new crimes, and prevents thousands of other children and adults from becoming new victims. And I think that the main struggle for us is is in this regard. We know a lot of stories how children try to resist under occupation, how Ukrainian children refuse to sing Russian national hymn and instead start to sing Ukrainian national hymn. And I always tell to myself, if children find a strength, find a creativity, how to resist to Russian aggression, we as adults have no excuse.
Thank you. Thank you, Oleksandra, for your strong, really, statement. And Dr. Whitman, you were also, with your extensive work on the human rights and protection of children, you were also helping to draft few UN resolutions, as well as Vancouver Principles. So you worked a lot with what is building of international principles and the guidance. I have a provocative question to you. Does it work?
It is a good question, and am I being heard? No. Okay, let me change. But I'm also going to be very kind and stick to answering your question for you, okay? I think that, first of all, when you start to do things like draft UN Security Council resolutions on matters related to improving the protection of children, you know that it's not perfect. The Security Council itself is a flawed institution, as we are witnessing right now. But I think that one of the things that's been so incredibly important about having Security Council resolutions that do talk about children in armed conflict is raising this awareness amongst those leaders and people who do sit on that council, that there is a body of organizations, as well as those who work within the UN, that are keeping track and trying to keep momentum on these issues. You know, prior to this whole movement with having resolutions on children in armed conflict, these weren't issues that were even discussed at the Security Council. So in my role as the executive director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, we see far too often that you have people who are sitting at negotiating tables talking about aspects related to peace and security who know nothing about the violations against children, know nothing about the impacts of decisions that they are making in terms of how to address conflicts, and are not putting children at the heart of those solutions. So when we think about these matters, it does help to raise those issues and start to flag it. If I looked at one of the resolutions we worked on, Security Council Resolution 2143, and you asked me if it helped, 2143 was actually the first resolution that was looking at a standardization of training for peacekeepers and national level forces on how to interact with children in armed conflict. And that was back in 2014. That was a bit of the impetus that started to create a movement towards the Vancouver Principles in 2017. And so I would say if you're asking me, does it work? Well, it's not the full solution, but it's one part of the problem that we have to address. And when we're looking at how to address issues related to children and improving their protection, we need to see the gaps that exist out there, as well as the opportunities that exist for us to do more and to do better. And I'm going to leave my response there for you.
Thank you. Thank you. And so I would like also ask Lesia that the government of Ukraine, as Darya said, is working on with the platform of coordination center. We have an engagement of the civil society. We have the engagement of the foreign governments, and I really want to thank you, Canadian government, for stepping in and showing the leadership in supporting the children. And even as we were watching today the testimony of those Ukrainian children who came back to their families, it's important to tell the stories. And this was done by the search project, which was supported by Canadian government, so that we are ready to share with you the real stories of the real children who went through the horror of the war. And it's important as we are doing the advocacy, as we are sharing with the world what these children are going through. And it's important because we all need to understand that time is of a huge pressure. Now these children, some of them are 1 to 3 years old, some of them are older. The longer they will live in Russian captivity, the longer they will live in Russian families, the more harder they will be hurt, and the harder for us will be to take these children back. And my question to you, Lesia, as a member of the parliament, what could you do on the you're doing a lot about the parliamentary diplomacy. I'm as ambassador getting a lot of the statements of Ukrainian parliament, engaging with the parliaments around the world to take the actions. So what are you doing? What are your actions that Ukrainian parliament is doing? How you're also traveling with many countries and advocating for this? What are your messages to your colleagues, members of the parliament, about the actions needed?
Thank you very much for the question, dear friends, dear colleagues. It's a great honor for me to be here and to talk to you in such very important question for our country. First of all, I would like to start with a great thanks to the Canada, to the Canadian Parliament, which one of the first countries actually recognized the Russians' actions in Ukraine as genocide. We highly appreciate this act. If we talk about the current situation and our words to our colleagues in different parliaments, I would like to say that both words and actions of Russians officials indicate the intent to separate our children from their families, from their nationalities, from their actually country. And now we are talking according to the official speeches from Belova, from Nebesia in UN, about 730,000 of Ukrainian children which are now in temporary occupied territories or in Russia. Maybe yesterday, we also got the information from the British intelligence that there are about 11,000 of our children in Russian re-education camps. It's about 33 re-education camps throughout Russia. And it's really terrible. And what will be the next? I would like to highlight your attention on a very important fact. Last week, the State Duma of Russia adopted their state budget for the next year. And if we look in, we can see that the budget for defense in 2024 will be about $400 billion for defense. It's the half of the budget for defense in the United States. And the same budget they will have during 2025 and 2026. It's a big signal for all of you that they will continue the aggression against the democracy in the whole world. It's not now not only about the Ukraine, it's about all countries which have the democracy and civilization development. If we talk also about our parliamentary work, I would like to highlight that the first resolution was adopted in the Parliamentary Assembly of Europe. I am the member of this organization from the Ukrainian side in 2022. Also, we have the same resolution which recognizes the Russians' actions from the aggression in NATO, in other countries, and we highly appreciate the same resolution in different parliaments throughout the world. What we would like kindly to ask you in this sphere. First, strongly condemn the crimes committed by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and Ukrainian children and call on the Russian side to immediately stop the genocide of Ukrainian people. The second one, take all possible measures to establish the whereabouts of Ukrainian children who were illegally deported from the territory of Ukraine. To increase pressure on Russia to ensure its immediate and unconditional abolition of the decision to simplify the procedure of obtaining citizenship of the Russian Federation for Ukrainian orphans or children left without care. Comprehensively assist UN bodies and relevant international organizations in obtaining complete information of the protection children who were deported to Russia, including those children who were later adopted or transferred to Russian foster families. To do everything we could for the return of Ukrainian children to their homeland as soon as possible. And the last but not the least, we're also looking for your support in the establishment special international tribunal, because all our Ukrainian boys and girls, all our Ukrainian women and men, they are looking for the justice. Now we are fighting it not only for democracy, but for our existence and for our freedom. And we kindly ask you also to support us to demonstrate for our kids justice in the case of the establishment special tribunals for top political and military leaders of Russia. It will be a great signal that democracy is exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy we still have 10 minutes, so I will have like a few more questions. I will probably start with Aagje. We are talking, and it's a bit of topic, but it's also very important. We are talking as the war started. There were over 7 million of Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine to find a safe place, and majority of them were women with children. There were independent reports several months ago published that, unfortunately, but the level of the video content calling or searching for Ukrainian women for the sexual industries increased significantly in many Western countries. And also, as Ukrainian mothers with children in many places around the world now as looking for a temporary shelter, our children, even in this country, still unfortunately are at risk to be part of the human trafficking. And how do you see from your perspective and the organization you're chairing, how big this issue is and what could be done in those countries where we are all together the same minded, but unfortunately sometimes these crimes even happen there? What we should do, what institutionally we need to increase? Is there any additional capacity needed to protect these children as well?
Thank you for that question, and a really interesting one. Every woman with children who was on the move was at risk in a sense. I would agree with that. And one of the things that was that went well in the 27 member states of the EU was the fact that there was the Temporary Protection Directive, which has existed for the last 20 years, but which had never been activated. And that's a mechanism that gives people fleeing a certain conflict or a certain crisis immediate access to certain rights, the right to housing, the right to access to the job market, access to the housing market. And I think that definitely was one of the great things that happened, that this was activated quite immediately, unanimously, by the various member states of the EU. And this meant protection, because women were not dependent on the illegal market. They were not dependent on the illegal labor market. So that very much reduced the risk of trafficking. However, and that was the other thing we also saw in the EU, what didn't go so well with that is that because they were part of this temporary protection mechanism, they weren't registered in the same way as we would register within Europe normally. Normally would register movements of children across various countries. And I think that shows you two things that are needed. First of all, really access to legal housing, access to legal access to schools for children, that was one of them as well, access to the job market, but on the other hand, also a very good registration mechanism of where children are, if there are secondary movements, who they are moving with. One of the things that we, for example, saw is that this the platform for registration that was going together with temporary protection didn't register who a child was moving with, if the child, if lots of children were traveling with their aunts, with their neighbors, because their mothers couldn't go with them, or because their fathers had to be left behind. So that was something that we saw as well. So I think those are two really important things. On the one hand, registration, good registration of who is where. You cannot protect a child if you don't know that it's in your country, if you cannot see it in the system. And I think that's definitely something in Europe that we're grappling with. We have an understanding of how many children are in the countries. It's more than 7 million, but not all of those are registered in local child protection systems. They're not all registered in the temporary protection platform. And so that's really something to work towards, to have both good registration, but also access to some basic rights, housing, work, school, health, to avoid that people become victims of trafficking.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Whitman, we've talked a lot during these panels about the need for justice, but also there were some words about the gaps in international law, gaps in approaches, and sometimes it's because the world haven't seen actually such kind of scale of aggression after the Second World War, and a lot of like UN and all of the international law has been built at post-Second World War. We now altogether see those gaps. You're working a lot also with the international organizations and on the international for what gaps do you see there? And what can we all together, after this panel, I do believe that after this panel, we will do some kind of a volunteer working group to work on it. How do you see these gaps? What needs to be improved? And where you think the efforts of all of us need to be put, whether it's UN, whether it's OSCE or the other institutions, to first of all, like to bring the children back, and also to create a precedent and to avoid in the future and any other armed conflict such a huge amount of the children who are suffering from that.
I think really good points. I would say, first of all, we need to do a better job at prevention. There's a lot of talk in this world about preventing atrocities and preventing violations against children, but we don't actually use the mechanisms that we have to make sure that we can do so. I would say a good example of a prevention dynamic that I did want to raise is Ukraine creating a prevention plan with the SRSG office, Children in Armed Conflicts office, it's one example of something. If we could start to see early on that there were signs of potentialities of violations, and we could get more countries to start to agree to tangible action plans that could help prevent further violations against children, I think that's one type of a gap I would like to raise. I think a next gap that I would raise that I think is important, and you flagged it when you talked about the Vancouver Principles, is that I do think that one of the things that has to happen far more around the world is that we do work with the security forces in countries around the world so that they're more prepared, both from a tactical and operational perspective on how to handle to prevent violations against children. So what could we be putting in place? It's still early days for a lot of countries. I know Ukraine has endorsed the Vancouver Principles along with 106 other nations, but I think that that's an important piece because you have to have security sector involved. It's one thing to have the lawyers and to have the child protection and human rights organizations, but the very institutions which are charged with protecting the civilians need to also be engaged in knowing how to better know where and when and how are children, possibly subjected to issues. And then I think the other thing that I just wanted to raise before I close here, peace education is really important right now in the world. And as much as there are all of these horrific violations that have been detailed today here about the children in Ukraine and the children who have been taken, if we want long-term peace and stability in that region, we're going to have an approach which also engages not only the Ukrainian children, but the Russian children on a better path forward. And I just want to raise that because I think that no matter where the children are on the side of a conflict, it's never their fault. It's always the fault of the adults who are making these decisions. And so long-term peace and stability, I've seen it in many conflicts around the world. If we don't address that at the core at a much younger age, we're not going to get us to a space where we can ensure that the protection of the children you want to protect are also protected. And this dynamic is something we have to think about as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the panelists for being with us. Thank you for listening to this panel. Again, have a good night. In Europe, we still have one more panel for the conference. Thank you. And we will join in 15 minutes. Okay, I'll do your job in 15 minutes for a fourth panel. Thank you.